Hello, everybody. How are you guys doing? It's great to see you. We have just about 400 people who've joined the live stream. I only see 150 likes, though, which is scandalous. So make sure that number goes up. Good. I see it's already going up. I have a very special guest with me today. A great friend of the show, a great personal friend. It's Professor Marandi. He's, as you know, of course, he's not just a professor at the University of Tehran, but he's also acting as an advisor to the Iran delegation right here in Vienna in the nuclear talks. Professor, how are you? Thanks for coming by and joining the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
The pleasure is mine, Professor. You know, if we could just start off with, can you maybe bring us up to speed on the nuclear talks? I mean, this is one of the hottest issues right now, and it's got itself involved in Ukraine, and we'll get to Ukraine in a moment. But maybe bring us up to speed.
Well, as you know, there have been talks going on for a very are getting close to an agreement. We still don't have an agreement. There are differences between Iran and the United States, and of course, the Europeans representing the United States means that there are differences between Iran and the Europeans and the United States. Those differences have to be bridged, and until that moment, we still don't have a deal, because as many have said repeatedly, until the very end, until the moment when all the ambiguities are resolved and all the brackets are removed, the text is not complete. So, but we are pretty close. But we have to keep in mind that usually the toughest things, or at least some of the toughest things, are left for the end. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But we also have another problem, and that is that after the Ukrainian war, the United States and its allies have sanctioned Russia, and they've sanctioned them from top to bottom. And now the Russians are saying, well, this is going to cause a problem for us. Which is, there are two ways of looking at it. One is with regards to Russians' involvement in the implementation of the deal, meaning the nuclear program itself, and let's say the removal of highly enriched uranium, which is understandable. Then there are issues about Russian trade with Iran, which, looking at it from the Russian perspective, I would understand why they would say that, but looking at it from an Iranian perspective, the hope is that this conflict between Russia and the United States does not leave any Iranian windows broken. I would have to remind everyone, though, that the sanctions were imposed by the United States, and during all these years when the United States had sanctioned Iran and the Europeans abided by the United States, the demands of the United States, the Russians, the Chinese tried to keep things as normal as possible. And during the talks, it was the Russian and the Chinese that were more constructive, both in 2015 and now, especially the Russians. But we hope that the deal is agreed upon. We hope that the remaining brackets are removed, and that the issue that exists between Russia and the United States does not affect the deal. So let's see how that plays out. No one can really say, because some of the issues are important for us. And the Americans, they've been dragging their feet for months. I never expected to be in Vienna so long. And on numerous occasions during the last 3 months, I thought the negotiations would break down, and we were on the verge of going back to Tehran on a number of occasions.
Right.
And on a number of occasions, I thought that we were pretty close. And then it turned out that we weren't that close. So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I would say that the chances are that we are not very far off from removing the last brackets from the text, the different sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously just speculation. No one can tell. When I asked the Russian ambassador last year in May, he told me it's a few weeks away. Obviously, I don't blame him or something. And he doesn't have a crystal ball. But I always ask when I can, because I think this is a lot of people want to see some sort of steps in the right direction, and this is one of them. When you say there are these brackets that still need to be addressed, are we talking about sanctions removal? Is it specifically that?
It's a host of issues. It's assurances, guarantees. It's sanctions related. It's a combination of these different issues. So some of them are more important than others, but still they're issues that have to be resolved. And my understanding is that as we speak, the issues have not yet been completely resolved. We'll have to see over the next few days what happens. But again, there's the issue of U.S.-Russian conflict. We have to see how that impacts the negotiations. Hopefully it won't, but we have to wait and see.
Okay, so this brings me to the elephant in the room, which is the war in Ukraine.
Right.
The Russians have come in and said that we know you're sanctioning Russia, but we want an exemption in terms of our trade with Iran, because the idea, I'm just explaining this again to the viewers, is that let's say tomorrow morning the JCPOA is, it's back in full with the U.S. entering the deal again, and all of these sanctions.
The U.S. won't be entering the deal for a long time, even if it's implemented, because there are stages,
right?
And until the very end, the U.S. won't be allowed in. But yes,
right. But let's say everything is rosy and perfect, and all the sanctions are removed from Iran. Iran could then be sanctioned the next morning because it has ties with Russia, right? So the Russians are saying that they want Iran to be spared this fate. Yep.
That is also a valid statement, that if Iran decides to work with Russia, because the United States has sanctioned Iran, the Europeans probably won't be working with Iran that easily, and therefore it's the Russians and the Chinese that will be more interested. And if the Russians are sanctioned, then it will be difficult for Iran to work with Russians. So that is an issue. But as I said, hopefully there will be a way forward. There will be a solution about this problem. Right now, the focus is on ending the negotiations and having a final text. And I'm sure on the sidelines, discussions are taking place. One of the important things is that right now, everyone wants to have dialogue with Iran. Iran is suddenly very important for all sides, because in this tragic war, and as you've probably seen in my Twitter account, my tweets, that I understand that the United States lied about expanding NATO. I understand that the United States helped bring about a coup. I understand the United States supported right-wing extremists, Nazis in Ukraine, and that the war didn't begin now, began in 2014. Russian Ukrainians were killed in large numbers, 14,000, I think, according to the UN, by the Ukrainian regime, and that NATO soldiers just a few months ago were parading in Kiev, or Kyiv, or whatever they like to call it nowadays. But I'm completely opposed to the war. And but the fact is that this tragic war everyone is a loser. But what it did was that it enhanced Iran's position significantly. And I'd like to make a comparison, and that was the Iraqi War against Kuwait, and then subsequently, I'll leave it at that. The Iraqi War against Kuwait, Saddam's war against Kuwait, his war against Kuwait enhanced Iran's position significantly as well, because Saddam Hussein had to accept Iran's borders, he had to release Iranian prisoners, a lot of things happened that benefited Iran. Iran came out of isolation. Many countries were turning to Iran, especially regional countries, and Iranian oil sold very well. So Iran's position was enhanced significantly, even though back then, and this is something that I think your viewers should keep in mind, the Iranians were against that war as well. The Iranians were against the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I was a part of the anti-war coalition in the UK. I was a PhD student back then, because in Iran we didn't have a PhD program in English literature and Orientalism. The Iranians were opposed to the war, even though they despised Saddam Hussein, but they did not consider American occupation of Iraq to be legitimate. And so even though Iran has good relations with Russia, Iran is opposed to the war. War in general, it's not something that anyone should support.
Yeah.
But that NATO, in my opinion, is the most to blame. They pushed Russia in this direction, just like they're constantly provoking countries across the board. They try to squeeze Iran, crush Iran, provoke Iran. They do it to all countries. And so NATO is, in my opinion, more to blame than anyone else.
Yeah, it's like we were talking just earlier. All the refugees that are coming in from Ukraine. It's really tragic, whether it's from Syria, Ukraine, makes no difference. They're civilians at the end of the day.
Well, there is a big difference, and that is that no one cares about Yemeni people. We know that now. I think you can't say the good thing about this war. There's nothing good about war, but one of the things that this war has exposed is the sheer amount of racism, open racism, in liberal media. And that for years we've all been screaming about Yemen. For years we've all been screaming about ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and NATO support for them. For years we've been all outraged about the sanctions on Venezuela, on Nicaragua, on Cuba. And of course, the problem, maybe one of the most outrageous, is the fact that the United States stole the money of Afghanistan. But there's no outrage for this, but the whole world is supposed to mobilize in sympathy for the Ukrainians, which all people who've been affected by war should be sympathized with, but it's very disproportionate. And it's clear that their lives are infinitely more valuable than the lives of the people living outside of the so-called Western.
Yeah, the videos, like one after the other, of these these news hosts, it's really.
But those are the blatant examples. The very fact that all we hear about day and night, we hear about the Ukrainians day and night. And then if we compare them to how the Iraq War was described by these very same people, I don't want to name names. Some of them know me, I know them, I don't want to name them. Yep. But BBC people, CNN people who went and were embedded with American soldiers when they were invading Iraq, is this the sort of language that they used?
Of course not.
About occupation? Or those who were in Baghdad, was this the sort of language that they were using? Were they talking about civilians? In fact, the Russians, they have not been using the sort of tactics that the Americans did in Iraq. The shock and awe that we saw in Iraq, where the Americans destroyed everything.
Yeah, I remember
the
that.
Infrastructure of the country, the government ministries, electricity, everything. The Russians haven't done this. I'm not saying that makes them not guilty of war, but the point is that what the Americans did was much worse. It was just as illegal. Since it was much worse, it was even more a greater violation of international law. Yet the whole of the Western media was rooting for the Americans and their coalition of the willing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just old enough to remember that. I can remember all this stuff, every single day, Tony Blair, Bush, Blunkett, Straw, all these
Actually,
people.
I mean, the first anti-war protest, as far as I remember, in England, was in Birmingham. I was a part of it. It was before the invasion of Afghanistan, and Blair had come to Birmingham to open a European Studies Institute at the University of Birmingham. And there were about 70 of us standing there protesting against the war against Afghanistan, because the logic was that 9/11 is blowback. You brought about this whole situation by supporting Al-Qaeda and extremists in Afghanistan. And as we know, Brzezinski and Carter actually supported these groups in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade.
Right.
They wanted to create a Vietnam, so they wanted the Soviet Union to come in. And sadly, the Soviet Union took the bait, sort of like what Russia did now. But in any case, and I know a lot of people will disagree with me on both sides, but that's my view. I'm totally against NATO, and I'm totally against the war. But in Afghanistan, when we were doing that protest, there were like 70 of us, and Blair came, and he went to, back then he was very popular, of course. But we thought, okay, there were about 70 of us. And then when he came out, we saw there were three young ladies who were in our crowd who were waving at him. So it was obvious that not everyone was protesting the war. But there weren't even 70 of us, maybe, I don't know, 60 some were really protesting the war. But that, I sort of feel like this is what the mood is now again. I see parallels between now and 9/11 and after 9/11. After 9/11, many people in the West became very irrational because Al-Qaeda, true, what they did was utterly evil, but instead of looking to the actions of their own governments and to their responsibility and what they did that brought about this situation, and their support for extremism in Afghanistan, which they repeated later on in Syria. And I'm sure your viewers, because you have a very loyal audience, they all know about Jake Sullivan's letter to Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, a decade after 9/11. But so it's just history repeats itself. But
right.
At that time, after 9/11, people, instead of looking at the context, instead of contextualizing, most people became pro-war. They believed the mass media. And now again, I feel that it's the same thing. While it's easy to criticize Russia for attacking, but many people are closing their eyes to the reality of what NATO did in eastern Ukraine, the coup, and the racism, the Nazis, and all that. They're closing their eyes to this reality, and the media, of course, is simply cheerleading.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just astonished how they, they want to remove all of the past, the history, the context, and it's like it's like talking to a brick wall or like a bunch of like a stubborn goat or something. they just don't want to budge. And again, it doesn't excuse what Russia's doing, but you can't just act like it happened in a vacuum.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Professor, you were touching on just a few minutes ago how this situation is a bit like Kuwait, where it's advantageous to Iran. Again, obviously, no one is happy that there's a war on, but just geopolitically speaking, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on that? Because is it just politically speaking good for Iran, or also economically speaking? Because there's also an issue with oil and gas prices now, and if sanctions are lifted, then of course that helps Iran in a multitude of ways. No?
Well, I mean, environmentalists won't be too happy with me, but Iran has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world and the second largest natural gas reserves. And Iran, therefore, has huge potential. And now that we have this war going on, all of Iran, because Iran had a huge problem exporting its oil.
Right.
And in recent months, Iran was able to sell all that it produced in the last 3-4 months, especially. But Iran had amassed a large amount of oil on different tankers. because they couldn't sell it. For a couple of years, Iran had difficulty selling oil, so they would rent tankers, old tankers, just to keep the oil there. Because if you stop producing oil, it can damage the oil wells. I'm not an expert. This is just, this is as far as my knowledge goes. Over the last 2 weeks or 13 days, I'm not quite sure how many days ago the war started or when this happened, but all of the Iranian oil in these tankers were sold. So these were tens of millions of barrels, maybe up to 70 million barrels. I'm not sure. I may be wrong. But a very large quantity of Iranian oil was sold. So in general, Iranian sales are up. All of its stored oil, whether on tankers or in tanks or anywhere across the globe, they've been sold. And everyone wants to talk to Iran. Europeans are much more keen on speaking with Iran. The Americans are constantly trying to find a way to speak with Iran. The Russians need Iran. The Chinese need Iran. And under these circumstances where NATO and Russia are basically slugging it out directly or indirectly, that strengthens Iran's status. Again, war is not to be welcomed, and I'm very happy that Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, when he spoke about this, actually it was like 2, 3, 4 days after I started tweeting against, saying that both sides are wrong. He made the same statement not under the influence of my tweets, but he basically said he blamed NATO, he blamed the United States, but he also said we're completely against war.
Of course.
So I think that, and I believe that this war, if it continues, and I think it will continue for the time being, it will bring down the current world order. And I don't think there will be a new world order. I think there will be more of a disorder with centers of power, some more important, some less important. I also think a lot of governments may struggle. I mean, if you remember the Arab Spring or the awakening, a lot of it was impacted or influenced by the fact that people couldn't feed their families. The price of bread. Right now, the price of wheat has gone through the roof. So imagine how that's going to impact so much of Africa. I mean, you won't even hear this on CNN or the BBC. They don't care. Well, at least the bosses don't care. But I think that with the prices going up as they are, fuel and wheat and other vital commodities, that you're going to see huge problems in parts of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and in Europe as well. But the most vulnerable, I mean, they could be heading for starvation. But in any case, Iran's status, Iran has been able to break the sanctions because all sorts of people are buying Iranian oil, and they couldn't care less about the American sanctions because they're concerned about fuel. So in a sense, the war has broken the sanctions regime to do. That doesn't mean that Iran doesn't want to deal. Iran will continue to move towards an agreement, and Iran hopes that the conflict between the United States and Russia does not impede the implementation of the agreement. Iran is against sanctions altogether. It's because it targets ordinary people. It doesn't target government. When you try to strangle ordinary people, I mean, there are ways to deal with governments, but the United States and the Europeans simply they either use hot war or they use sanctions, which are siege warfare.
Yep. And
they like to say that there's no other way to do it, but if that's the case, then why don't they ever use these against their own allies, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel or right-wing governments in Latin America or despotic regimes across Asia?
And you talked about the world shifting towards a more multipolar order.
Or disorder.
Or disorder, right. Do you think Iran is going to be part of that emerging global south or emerging order, along with China, Russia?
Yes, I think Iran is already the most important country in West Asia. And Iran and its allies are the most influential force in West Asia. And that is going to be strengthened. Iran's or the United States and Iran's antagonists, and its main antagonist at the moment being the United States, that their strength will diminish, because I think this war is going to, the biggest loser in this war, in my opinion, will be Europe. But the United States and Russia will both be harmed. I mean, the Americans benefit from this war in the sense that they were able to divorce Europe from Russia. They were able to stop, through constantly pushing Russia, they were able to end the whole Nord Stream 2 project, and much, much more now. But so they now divorced Europe from Russia, which I think was very important for the United States. But it will have, I think, enormous, unbelievably high economic costs for Europe. It will be devastating for Europe. And it will not be good for the United States economically at all. And it will not be good for Russia. So that enhances Iran's importance. That and its allies. Again, make no mistake, I'm not happy about this situation. I'm just explaining. Otherwise,
of course,
I fought in war my youth from the age of 16 to 22. I was injured 4 times in war, twice through chemical attacks, once a shrapnel wound, and once I was shot in my arm. I've been to cities that were devastated in Iran. I went to Lebanon both before and after the war, immediately almost. I spent a lot of time in Syria during this dirty war that NATO, Erdogan, Israelis, and Saudis and others have all been engaging against the people of Syria. I've seen the devastation in Douma, Idlib, Aleppo, and Hama, and across the country. And I was in Iraq during the liberation of Mosul. I went to Mosul on the very next day to the mosque where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi would announce his Islamic State. And I saw the devastation that the Americans created, the bombing of Mosul. The same thing that they're accusing the Russians of doing, but much worse. Of course, the Russian bombing in eastern Aleppo was also very severe. And I should put in parentheses that the Iranians who were fighting were opposed to that sort of bombing camp. It was not in Iran. But in any case, the point that I'm making is that I'm utterly against war, and this war should end immediately. There are definitely other solutions to problems without trying to strangle people like what the Americans are constantly engaging in war, like what the Americans are doing across the world, although no one cares, like in Yemen, where they're doing it with the Saudis, or in Iraq or Afghanistan, or in Syria, and also what the Russians are doing, regardless of the role that NATO played to push Russia in that direction. It's no good. None of this. It's all tragic.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, Professor. And if we're just going back to the economic costs, I mean, I can just tell you, for example, today, 1 gallon of regular gasoline reached $4.17 in the U.S. This is after Biden just banned, Russian oil and gas imports, and fair enough. Russia only accounts for about 3% of crude imports in the U.S., but nevertheless, the prices of crude have gone through the roof. They're the highest since July 2008. The European gas prices are through the roof. Doesn't this look like the West is, they're shooting themselves in the foot?
Without a doubt. They if you watch CNN and BBC, which, by the way, I mean, I've never watched North Korea, so and I know how it's portrayed, but I think that CNN and BBC, because it's in my hotel room, not that I really watch. If I'm at home, I would never watch them, but it's like watching from how they describe it, North Korean TV. They're almost identical, except for the graphics. And then, you know, they bring on someone for 10 minutes, and he says that Putin is mad, okay? And the, you know, host is sort of like encouraging him. Then this one goes, and the next person says, well, Putin has brain cancer, or then he agrees and says, well, that's an interesting theory. And then the next person comes and says Putin is completely evil, and this is how the whole day goes. Yep. You know, Russia is evil, Ukraine is good. Nothing about neo-Nazis, nothing about Nazis, nothing about the coup. You know, it's a democracy, but the opposition leader is they're charging him with treason. Their media outlets are shut down. Russians are suppressed. So this is not going to be heard. You won't hear this on any of these media outlets. It's a democracy. Zelensky is a wartime leader, although he was brought to power by an oligarch, right, and funded by an oligarch. None of this will be said. It's just some innocent regime, decent, good, you know, government, just attacked because Putin wanted to attack the country. That's how they're narrating the story, and it's really, I mean, I expected it, and before we began, I think on the way here, walking in the cold, I was telling you that it was not unexpected, but it's still interesting to see how blatant.
Yeah, and are you surprised that Al Qaeda are now coming from northern Syria, from Idlib into Ukraine?
Well, look, when the Americans hide the fact, and the Europeans hide the fact that they're supporting Nazis and they're supporting right-wing fascists, when all that is being hidden, and we won't hear that until years later, when the emails start coming out and so on, why would that surprise anyone? Because that's exactly what they were doing in Syria. So why not use the same Al-Qaeda, ISIS forces, or their affiliates that were in Syria in Ukraine? It makes sense. They're the same thing. Yep. They're the same thing. They're evil. They are intolerant. They're supremacists. Sort of. I mean, the Americans are supremacists, but you know, they do it from the air. These people cut people's heads off, and no, I'm not surprised at all. I think that Turkey, as a part of NATO, would definitely, I mean, Erdogan, Turks, I think my understanding is that most Turks now disagree with these policies, even people in his own party. But no, I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, I was expecting such a thing. I think many of us were.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially after they declared that, you know, it's a free-for-all. Everyone can just come. There's no visa requirement. I mean,
well, that's what they did in Syria, too. In Syria in 2012 and 13, intelligence agencies across Europe were facilitating these people to travel to Turkey and then from Turkey into Iraq. I know families. I know two families in the UK who told the police, extended families, about a person in their extended family who was being influenced by extremists, and those extremists were encouraging him to go to Syria. They went and told the police, and the police told them not to worry about it. And on both occasions, the two young men both went to Syria separately. I know these people, so they knew what was going on. They allowed different places across Europe to be active, to recruit. And that's what they're doing now in Ukraine. And I'm willing to, well, I'm not willing to bet, I'm not a betting person, but I'm pretty sure that 5 years from now, many of these people who go to Ukraine, if the war continues for a long time, when they go back, they're going to be arrested. For being fascist, for being this, and because They're creating. This is you don't play with extremism and get away with it unscathed. You don't create ISIS and Al Qaeda and get away unscathed. It's in Europe. In Europe, after what we saw in World War II, and the Nazis were not just in Germany. The Nazi ideology existed across Europe and in the UK. Many intellectuals, many of the people who you and I know, like novelists and writers, and they were influenced by the Nazi ideology. English novelists, European novelists, artists, and so on. It wasn't just Germany. So if they want to play with fire again, especially at a time when the global economy is going downhill, and after this war, it's going to go downhill much faster in Europe. The economy goes down, you're playing with fascists. I don't think that's going to end up very good.
What are your thoughts on these biolabs that we saw Newland talking about them with Marco Rubio during this hearing. It's the top story today. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I saw your tweet. I also tweeted the clip. I think you also tweeted the clip. I would advise everyone to take a look at Newland's body language and the way she speaks. It was obvious that she was extremely uncomfortable. There's obvious that there's something really horrific going on. And they don't want the Russians to have access to it. If it's open access, if it's nothing secret, then who cares if the Russians have access to it? No, there's definitely something really, really bad going on there.
And Professor, if we could just go back to briefly to the Russians saying that they want this kind of written guarantee that Iran won't be punished for maintaining its ties with Russia. What about the Chinese? I've heard reports that the Chinese are also saying they support this idea. Do you have any idea if that's true?
I can't go into much detail, but the situation for the Chinese is very different from that of the Russians. It's not the same.
Okay.
Hopefully it'll all be resolved with patience. The Iranians are very patient. The Americans, over the last 3-4 months, the Americans have been dragging their feet the whole time.
They say the Iranians are dragging their feet.
Well, so. The only way that they can say that is if they assume that the Iranians are going to accept, that we're going to accept what the Americans wanted, and that was a very partial implementation of the point. That what was happening was that the Iranians were saying these sanctions must be lifted, and the Americans were saying no, we don't want to lift these sanctions. So they are the ones who are dragging their feet. Or when the Iranians were saying, well, in 2015 we did not have, unfortunately, a verification process for the removal of sanctions. We did have for a verification process to monitor Iran's implementation, and that was the International Atomic Energy Agency. But there was no verification process to show that the Europeans and the Americans were actually removing sanctions. This time round, an elaborate mechanism was created as a verification process.
So there will be something to verify that the U.S.
Yes, if there's a deal. If there's a deal. So yes, so the Americans were dragging their feet because they didn't want to have a and the Europeans, they didn't want to have a verification process. So there's nothing here for anyone to, drag Iran's feet. It's their side that has to, or the issue of guarantees and assurances, where the Americans, we don't want the Americans just to leave. And since the Iranian side saw that the Americans weren't going to give those assurances, and the Iranians, I think, knew from the beginning they weren't going to do so, but they kept saying assurances, assurances. And as a result, through that pressure, the Iranians were able to create inherent assurances. That is that.
How does that work then?
Preserving the Iranian nuclear program to a large degree in a way in which Iran could return to uranium. And that would be that would help prevent the United States from moving towards violating the deal. In other words, it would be costly.
Right, because the issue is that Obama signed the nuclear deal with Iran, and then just a few years later, Trump gets elected. And
but you have to remember that Obama never implemented the deal.
Right.
He lied from day one. Many sanctions were added afterwards in violation of the deal, both the text and the spirit of the deal. But more importantly, behind closed doors, Obama was threatening banks through the Treasury Department, banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, shipping companies, everyone, not to work with Iran. These were all violations of the deal because according to the deal, the United States must not only stop trying to block the normalization of Iranian trade and business, but also it must help to normalize it.
Yep.
So Obama was violating the deal, and Trump, of course, tore up the deal altogether.
Right. So the idea is that let's say everything goes smoothly now with Biden. Iran doesn't want another Trump or whoever who comes along and just tears it up again. Right, or Biden himself. So the idea is to create simply a mechanism to make sure that the Americans can't, bail on the deal again. But again, how would that work? So
that it becomes costly, because if the Americans decide to suddenly leave, because even if the Americans gave Iran assurances from the beginning, the House and the Senate, the whole of all 100 senators agreed to Iranians' assurances, and the House. Iran knows that if 6 months from now, if the U.S. president says, well, Iran did this or that, we have to punish Iran, all of them would vote 100 to 0 to return the sanctions. Yep. So Iran kept saying, we need assurances, and when they couldn't deliver, what the Iranians did was say, okay, well then we need the capability to rapidly bring our enrichment program extensively online, and this is a deterrent to make the Americans and the Europeans think twice before breaking their promises.
Right, but okay.
I mean, the nuclear program will have caps on it.
Yeah.
But the Iranians will be able to move towards enrichment and the Iranians don't need to do it. They don't want to do it. If the Americans and the Europeans abide by their commitments, everything is fine.
Yep.
But the thing is that they have a history of dishonesty, deception, and you know how the Western media works. They will blame you for it. So right now, they're saying, they kept making deadlines for Iran, which all of them were, we went past those deadlines and nothing happened, which shows how powerful Iran is becoming.
Yeah.
When the Europeans and the Americans together keep posing deadlines and the Iranians ignore them, it shows that things are changing. And also it shows the attitude of the new Iranian administration, the president and so on, being more assertive and
the hardliner, so to speak.
Yes, I mean, he's not I wouldn't consider the president to be a hardliner, but he's more assertive with regards to Iran's rights. The previous president, he spoke from a weak position, and when you speak from when you're constantly saying we need a deal, we don't have money, and so on, the other side looks at your statements and increases the pressure. So for Dr. Zarif, who was negotiating back then, or his deputy, Dr. Arakchi, it is difficult to negotiate under circumstances where your boss is speaking like that. But when the president now is being more assertive and saying, no, we demand that all of our rights be respected, that of course strengthens the negotiating position. Dr. Bagheri, who's negotiating right now, who's also a very competent negotiator, and he's done quite well. But when you have a good, when you have a strong and assertive boss who's not making irrational demands, all of the Iranian demands are within the framework of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. Iran has never made new demands, because we are constantly hear Western media saying the Iranians are making. All of them are old demands. All of them are within the framework of the JCPOA. But the Western media, when necessary, they'll cheerlead for Western governments. That's just how it works. The notion that Western media is open and contain different viewpoints, and it's a part of the democratic process is nonsense. When you just watch BBC tomorrow, any your viewers, or CNN, and tell me how, and you can see how one-sided the narrative is. Utterly blatant.
Speaking of the viewers, we have about 1,400 people watching. Make sure you guys hit the like button. I only see 800 likes. But just going back to...
Well, the rest of them don't like me, so... They have no option.
Well, Professor, I wanted to ask you, because you said that basically the way to make sure the Americans, they don't tear up the deal again, is to have a strong deterrent. What do you say to the people who then argue that, Iran has advanced too far into its nuclear program? It's gained this knowledge, it's gained this technology, and it's just simply not possible to cap the nuclear program like before, and that the situation has changed. Because
what does too much knowledge mean? It means too much knowledge for the Americans and the Europeans to feel happy with, or too much meaning beyond Iran's right within the NPT and international law. Mm-hmm. Iran has developed its nuclear program extensively after Trump left. If Trump had remained in the deal, if Obama had committed himself to the deal instead of trying to cheat Iranians, if Biden had returned to the deal, we wouldn't be as nearly as advanced today.
Of course, that's the irony.
So they forced Iran into this position. But in any case, Iran's progress is all within the framework of international law. And I think many of your viewers know that the Israelis for decades have been saying that Iran is months away from a bomb, a year away from. I think the first person that was Perez, I think, like in 1991, I'm not sure. But like in 1991, he was saying it's like a few months away or a year away. But whatever, it's like been decades that if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, Iran would have had it a very long time ago. I mean, look at Iran's capabilities to send satellites into orbit.
Right.
Iran's,
just the other day,
in nanotechnology, Iran is third or fourth in the world in many fields in stem cell research. Iran has made, despite the sanctions, has made huge progress. And a point that I should stress, because this is something that I'm personally, it's a personal issue. When Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iran, and those chemical weapons were given by EEC countries, by the European countries, EU countries today, the initial, let's say, group of EU countries. They gave Saddam chemical weapons. The Germans, the Europeans, and the Americans, and they gave him the political cover and also the military intelligence to use those chemical weapons, not once or twice, not tens of times, hundreds of times, very extensively, killing many, many, many thousands of people. In just one attack in Halabja on a Kurdish city, 5,500 to 6,500 people were killed within minutes. I've been to Halabja, right after the attack, very soon after the attack. And no one was condemned. Iran, despite and I survived 2 chemical attacks. Despite the fact that we were being murdered by the European chemical and American chemical weapons and intelligence that they gave to Saddam, their man in Baghdad to use them, Iran never moved towards developing chemical weapons. And I think that shows a big difference between Iran and Western powers. And actually on Hard Talk on the BBC, I was on the show a few weeks ago, and I saw that you kindly did a show about that. But I said that on that show as well, that the difference between us and your regimes, the European and Western regimes, is that You give those chemical weapons and you allow people to use them extensively, and we were prevented from purchasing gas masks.
Yeah.
My gas mask was from North Korea. So the North Koreans gave us gas masks to protect ourselves. Western countries prevented us from getting gas masks, and they gave Saddam chemical weapons. So despite all that, Iran refused to produce chemical weapons.
Yep. And it is a stark difference and quite sobering. I think they must think that Iran is stuck in a different dimension and time warp, because they keep saying it's weeks away from a bomb. And
Iran is both backwards. It is a backward religious theocracy where people are living in, I don't know, caves, and we go around in camels, and the leaders are looking back to. But on the other hand, so we're backward, it's corrupt, it's evil, it's incompetent, it's all that. But paradoxically, it's also a threat to humanity, it's on the rise, it's developing You can't be both at the same time. You can't be both falling apart, incompetent, hated by your population, yet you're also rising menace that threatens world peace and stability. You can't have it both ways at the same time. But it shows how Western narratives are irrational, illogical. Mm-hmm. But this irrational narrative comes from latent Orientalism, this latent knowledge, where the other is evil, the other has all these negative attributes. So even when the attributes that are given or associated with them, even when they're inconsistent, like the one I just mentioned, or the ones that I just mentioned, where you can't have them both at the same time, since they're all seen as somehow negative, they don't see the inconsistency of the knowledge. They say, yeah, that seems right, that also seems right, even though they don't fit together, but they still accept it, because it belongs to that latent knowledge, or so-called knowledge, that has been acquired over centuries.
Let me ask you something, Professor. Do you think that that people in the West feel similarly about Russians? Because they're canceling Russian music now and all sorts of things.
I hear Russian cats are also an issue.
Yeah, and trees.
But people, people, you can have people like that everywhere in the world. The problem in Western countries is that what happens and how things evolve in Western countries impacts the rest of the world. Because of the Western Empire, because of colonialism, because of imperialism, because of their constant wars, and sanction one country, impose siege warfare. Right now you have thousands of British military advisors in Yemen helping the Saudi Air Force destroy Yemen. You have the American Navy helping the Saudis impose a siege. So you'd think that the Western media would be outraged, but they only talk about Ukraine, which is nothing compared to Yemen, which is really nothing compared. And Yemen's been going on for years. So, first of all, not all Western people think that way, and I know that that's not what you meant. And second of all, a lot of people are influenced by propaganda. They watch the BBC and CNN, and they believe their nonsense. And therefore, they forget, or they don't know about a lot of what they do. I mean, Britain, if Russia is doing wrong or evil in its invasion of the Ukraine, then what's the role of Britain in Yemen?
Of course. Then
Britain should be sanctioned. It should be. That's why I'm saying that these sanctions are not legitimate. Then the United States should be sanctioned. Their economies should be strangled, if that is the moral response that we're going to go after. But the point is that no blue eyes, no blonde hair, the eyes of many of these people. But there's a lot of people who oppose all this in Western countries. And I still remember the anti-war movement 2003 across Europe. But propaganda has huge influence. So we often think that people like ourselves are not easily, influenced by propaganda, but it's not always that simple. Even those of us who are constantly, looking at alternative. Most people don't have the time, like us, to go and check all these, alternative sources of media. That the guys, He's busy he's trying to survive. The lady's busy trying to sustain her, to pay the rent to the house, the mortgage or whatever. Life is tough. So many people, they're influenced by propaganda. So it's difficult but the people who you can blame are the elites. The people who work in the BBC, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, they know what they're talking about. If they don't, they shouldn't be working there.
What do you think about the role that Israel plays or doesn't play in what's happening in Ukraine, Russia? Because they've been trying to portray themselves as some sort of mediator. What would you make of that?
Well, if you go back, when the Americans were sanctioning China from years ago, but not extensively, and trying to prevent China from accessing high-tech high-tech goods or the technology itself from the United States, they allowed the Israelis to sell many of these things to China. So Israel always had this special pass, this special privilege. And I think as we speak, Israelis they don't act in the interests of the United States. They don't act in the interests of Europe. They don't act in the interests of Russia. They act in the interests of the apartheid regime. And their expectation is that the American people, Europeans, everyone should sacrifice themselves for them. And they often do. The money that they pay, even the hostility that they earn across the global south because of Israel is their own fault. And the Israeli regime doesn't pay as a result, but they pay because people see their hypocrisy. But I think it's going to be increasingly, if this war goes on for very long, and I find it difficult to see the war ending quickly. Hopefully it will end very quickly, but I find it difficult because once blood is spilled, then people dig in more. Unless there's a major defeat or a series of major defeats, I don't think either side has the will to end this. I think. Hopefully I'm wrong. But I think as this divorce between Europe and Russia and countries close to Russia by extension, and the United States, Europe, and on the one hand, and the Russians and their allies on the other, as this gets worse, I think both sides will be demanding countries like Israel, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, take us to choose sides. You're either with us or against us, as Bush would say. In the case of Iran, Iran doesn't work that way. Iran has always been independent. As I said, after the Russians attacked, Ayatollah Khamenei, even though in the middle of the negotiation, took the moral stance. He said, we don't, or when Saddam Hussein was about to be invaded, we hated Saddam, but Iran's position was against the war. Iran will still try to support its allies in Iraq, or Iran in this war will sell more oil. It will take advantage of the situation in a way that's not immoral. But Iran said that while it blames NATO for all the things that we discussed at the beginning, supporting neo-Nazis, the coup, killing Russian Ukrainians, suppression, and so on and so forth, but it opposes them. So,
at the UN General Assembly, they voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia.
That's right.
35 countries abstained. One of them was Iran. Is that part of the line?
Yeah, because there's no way that Iran could take sides. Iran, I mean, I would be deeply disappointed if Iran voted in favor of Russia or voted in favor of the United States, because when Saddam invaded Iran, our defense was a just defense. Or when Hezbollah defends itself, or the Palestinians defend themselves, or in Syria, regardless of whether you like the government or not, the extremists that NATO countries and their allies were trying to impose on the people were despised, and tens of thousands of them were foreign fighters. It was preserving Syria was a just cause. Because there's nothing absolute. Even if you say the Syrian government is bad, the other side is horrible. If you say the Syrian government is good, the other side is horrible. There's no comparison, no matter how Western countries like to frame it. These days, they keep saying Assad and Putin did the same thing in Syria. Well, regardless of what happened here, first of all, Iran was in Syria way before the Russians, and so was Hezbollah. They came in 2013.
Right.
After Western countries and their regional allies, the local despots, Mr. Erdogan had already brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters. ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham and all the other flavors of Wahhabism and Salafism.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, speaking of Wahhabism, I don't know if you saw this story just earlier today. The Wall Street Journal reported that Biden tried phoning the Saudis and the Emiratis, and they wouldn't pick up the phone. What did you make of that?
Well, you know, the Saudis and the Emiratis are, you know, they were supporting Trump. They supported Trump. They tried to influence U.S. internal politics, and Biden was punishing them. And now suddenly they find themselves in a very interesting situation because they export large amounts of oil. But ultimately, I think Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, I think we've already heard just a couple of hours ago before we began that the Emiratis were saying that we need to increase oil production. So ultimately, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they don't have that. They're not Iran. I mean, Turkey is not Iran. Turkey is a NATO country. They will do as told. Ultimately, Erdogan will. Right. He won't go that far. Saudis will have to, you know, take sides. It's not going to end well for them if they resist too much. But the point is that the U.S. problem with Russia can't be solved with just the Saudis and the Emiratis or anyone else producing oil. It's much more complicated than all the Russians have to do is not allow certain raw materials and minerals to be exported, and then that will devastate Japanese economy, European economies, and they can just export it to their friends like China, and who loses then? So it's the Americans have a lot of problems that they're going to have in the coming weeks, and the Europeans, and more so.
Yeah, and yeah, speaking of oil, we've been hearing for a couple of years now that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is not the president.
No, he isn't.
Right. And all of a sudden, the Americans are now trying to court him. They've sent a delegation there trying to displace Russian oil because they've banned it now.
And that shows the American morality. If he's a despot, if he's evil, then, you know, just for a few 100,000 barrels, you're going to legitimize. You've made the people of Venezuela suffer under siege warfare. You've killed so many innocent Venezuelans. Millions of people from Venezuela have left the country. They're in Chile and in other countries, you know, working, and their lives have been destroyed. Many of them would blame Maduro. Many of them will blame the Americans. But ultimately, it's the siege warfare. The Americans. It's really interesting. The Americans say, look, like Maduro, socialism doesn't work. I mean, I'm not a socialist. I believe in social justice. But they say socialism doesn't work. Well, you strangled the country, you strangled the economy, and then you say, look, see, it doesn't work. Or they strangle Iran and say, look, see, the Iranians can't manage their own economy. Well, you're strangling the country. You're crushing ordinary people. It's your doing. So they've strangled Venezuela. They've made people suffer for years. Cuba as well, other countries as well. And then after all that suffering, when you need them, you go back to them. That's the utter immorality. Yep. But they're the civilized world. They're the free world. They have freedom and democracy. And their people don't know it because there is no freedom and democracy. Because when the media And when the means of knowledge and information are monopolized by a few, how can you have democracy when you don't have information? You only have certain sources that give you information. So how do you make decisions? If I'm going to choose, but I only hear that you're bad and I'm good, or someone else is good, then there's not a chance in the world that you'll ever be elected. So you can scream bloody murder all you want on the streets of London or New York or Paris, but when the media ignores you or demonizes you collectively, I mean, look at Corbyn, for example.
Yeah.
He was, even though he appeased them, appeased them, he kept conceding to them. Ultimately, every single media outlet tried to destroy him, and they did. So,
I mean, Iran has close ties with Venezuela.
That's right.
So does Russia. What do you think the reaction from Maduro is going to be? He's going to tell them to go, to.
If I was Maduro, I'd drive a hard bargain. But yeah, I would force the Americans to give back what they stole. I would say, give back our gold. You stole our gold. Give the British. Give back our assets that you stole to the Americans. I would force the Americans. The thing is, if they think that the Americans are going to promise something and then they do something, the Americans will fulfill their promises. I've never seen that happen with Iran. Whenever the Americans promised Iran something, they lied ultimately. The Americans asked for Iran's help to free American hostages in Lebanon. It was before Hezbollah was created,
right?
By the way. And Iran did it. And they paid, through their credibility. They went to Lebanon, found these different groups. There were all sorts of small groups. And then the Americans did nothing. They instead increased the pressure on Iran. When 9/11 happened and the Americans wanted to take out Al-Qaeda, the Iranians helped them because it was a horrific crime committed against innocent civilians and citizens of the United States. When the Americans did it, Iran was the axis of evil. The nuclear deal, we had, Iran was always abiding by international law. Then the Americans tried to punish Iran. When we had the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, the Americans violated it under Obama, and under Trump they tore it up. So, Maduro would be very unwise to do anything before the Americans can give real and significant concessions. They're not concessions. They're the rights of the Venezuelan people that have been stolen from them by this empire.
Yeah. Do you think you'll see the Americans, going and begging the Iranians in a similar fashion, or even Syria? They might, try and be like, have the same attitude towards Assad in one point.
I don't want to go into detail, but we already see signs of that. And we already see signs that the Americans really want to talk to the Iranians. But the Iranians don't trust the Americans. They want relations with Iran. They know there are certain things that have to change. And one thing that is a fact, and that is that the United States is on the decline. And I think both because of its internal problems, because of the economic crisis, and now because of its conflict with Russia, and of course potential conflict with China, the Americans they have more than enough troubles. This is not the United States of the 1990s, not the United States after World War II. This is a much weaker country with many problems at home and many problems abroad. Therefore, it has to learn how to change its behavior. Otherwise, it's going to be much more painful for the American people. Americans, I think, they're experiencing their Suez moment. When during the Suez invasion, I think the British discovered that they don't have the sort of power that they had before.
Right.
And I think the Americans are going to very rapidly recognize that this is not the of 2, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Just some questions from the audience, Professor. But by the way, if you guys have any questions for Professor Marandi, feel free to put them in the comments. We'll try and pick out the best ones. So
you're not going to pay me, are you?
Maybe we'll bribe you with a few.
The only thing you gave me is a half a Coke, and I came all the way across the city.
I'm sure the viewers will buy you.
I walked in the cold and came here. God knows what time I'm going to get back to the hotel.
It's okay, Professor. The viewers I know will be kind enough to buy you another half a Coke. So someone is asking here, question to Marandi. This is from JD. They say, what's your take on General Soleimani and the assassination of him and the effect of that on Iran? Regards from Sweden. This is from Jonathan from Sweden.
Well, Jonathan, if it wasn't for General Soleimani, you would have ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates ruling over the whole of Syria, the whole of Iraq, probably the whole of Lebanon, and they would have probably moved into parts of Turkey, Saudi Arabia. The stupidity of those governments that supported them out of spite and because of Israel. I mean, some because of Israel and some like Erdogan because he thought he could create a larger empire for himself. This General Soleimani saved Syria and he saved Iraq. He led the war against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and in Lebanon. He and, of course, the Syrian government, the Iraqi government, the Iraqi Hashd al-Shabi, the Syrian Arab Army, Hezbollah, and then later on, of course, the Russians in Syria. But if it wasn't for him, all of these countries would be lost. The rich heritage of this part of the world would have been destroyed.
Yep.
And this is the most, I don't want to say the most ancient part of the world, but, second to none. I mean, there's China, there are civilizations that are old, but this is, the heritage in Syria, Iraq, and the whole region is extraordinary. Yemen, if it wasn't for General Soleimani, the siege on the Yemeni people, which goes on with the help of the Americans, NATO, and Canada, and I mean, the evil that Canada does shouldn't be underestimated because they like to present themselves as somehow different. And I'm not talking about ordinary people who feel incapable of bringing about change and people who want this all to end, but Canada, the prime minister is just he's just as evil as Mohammed bin Salman. He's just when they speak about Putin, they keep saying Putin, Putin. They're worse than Putin. If Putin is evil for Ukraine, right? If he's everything that they say he is on CNN and BBC and the New York Times, then they're 100 times worse. Every single one of them for what they've done. Just in Yemen alone, forget Libya, forget Syria, forget Afghanistan, Lebanon, they're strangling, forget Gaza, forget the Palestinians, forget the Venezuelans, forget the Nicaragua. The list goes on. These people they have no shame and no sense of morality. But General Soleimani, the Kurds, the Americans pretend to be the friends of the Kurds. When Arbil, the Kurdish city in northern Iraq, the center, the most important city, was about to fall, the head of that Kurdish territory, Barzani, contacted the Americans, the Europeans, NATO, everyone. They all said, we can't help you. He then called Soleimani, and Soleimani told him, to just wait, hold the city for a few days. He said, we can't. He says, hold the city till tomorrow morning, till I get there. He went himself. He went in the front lines in Iraq and Syria and pushed back ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So he was a great hero. And then again, the Americans just go and murder him. And based on a lie.
Yeah.
He was going there, and there was no big secret. I mean, he was traveling on a plane from Syria to Iraq. He was supposed to meet the Iraqi prime minister at that time said this. He was supposed to meet the prime minister of Iraq at 8 in the morning to discuss a letter exchange between Iran and Saudi Arabia to decrease tensions between the two countries. So he lands, he's leaving the airport at 1 a.m. As I said, in the morning he's supposed to see the prime minister, and the Americans assassinate. Not him, all the people with him. Not all the people with him only, but his Iraqi counterpart, who's leading the fight against ISIS in Iraq. Not only him, but also his entourage. All of them were murdered. And the very same Western media and the liberal media who opposed Trump, when it's killing Iranians. I mean, I think you remember when Trump first fired missiles into Syria in the name of chemical weapons, and we know that it was a false flag operation. Aaron Matei has written about that. Anyone who wants to read it, and others have as well, have written good articles showing what really happened, and OPCW and the whistleblowers, and you can read this on, I think, Grayzone and elsewhere. There's a lot of material. But in any case, when he struck Syria, Western commentators were saying he's finally become, liberals, those who hated him, say he's finally become president of the United States. Like, you're killing people. Or a senior newsreader said that, he spoke about the beauty of our weapons.
Yeah, Brian Williams. Yeah.
Exactly, on, I think, NBC. Right? He was at NBC, and I think later went to MSNBC. But in any case, wherever. So this is how the United States. This is how it works. So General Soleimani was a great hero, and another thing is that if, and what they say, the regime, they like to use the word regime to sort of delegitimize Iran. That's why in my tweets I constantly say the American regime and the European regimes, is sort of to reverse this narrative. But if the so-called Iranian regime, or if the Iranian political order was so unpopular, then why were so many millions of people taking part in his funeral? If Iraqis hate Iranians, why were so many millions of people in Iraq taking part in
Right.
his funeral?
Right. Just so the viewers know, it wasn't like one city. It was multiple cities,
it was
millions of people. I
unbelievable.
think they had to postpone the burial because there's too many people.
Absolutely. In Tehran, people almost died. The crowds were so huge.
Yep.
It was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Unprecedented.
It's honestly
And the sheer
jaw-dropping.
anger.
Yep.
Yeah, so I wouldn't believe much about what I read about him when it comes from the West. So
Yep.
if either all of us Iranians are extremely crazy and backward and evil, that is the reason why he was so popular, then or that the narrative is not true. And let me point out to, what was his name, Jonathan?
Yeah.
To Jonathan, that in Iran people know exactly what the West is saying about Iran, about Cuba, about Venezuela, about Ukraine, about anything, because you have all sorts of Persian language media funded by Western government, owned by Western governments, beaming into the country,
Right.
or on the internet, and they have a huge cyber army based in Albania, the MEK terrorist organization, which killed 17,000 Iranians and fought for Saddam Hussein. Now they're in Albania, behind, using computers. Each of them have 50, 60 different accounts, and they're waging online cyber warfare against Iran. So Iranians hear the other side day and night, yet
Yep.
they still go to Soleimani's funeral. But how many Americans have access to any information from Iran? How many Europeans have any access to Iranian TV? I mean, press TV, as you know, sanctioned. All Iranian media sanctioned. Now Russian media sanctioned.
Yeah.
My own Instagram account shut down. Facebook shut down. The accounts of hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people in our region, that their accounts have been shut, because I remember in one wave, like hundreds of thousands in Iraq were shut down, in Syria, and so in the West, they're not allowed to hear. I mean, just now, if people are watching from our part of the world, RT.com, you can't get it.
Yep.
You can't get the website. I tried before the show. I wanted to check something, and
Yep.
you can't get the website.
It's completely
so
censored.
why, if there's no freedom in the West, why, if you're not allowed to access alternative views, they're still democratic and civilized and so on. And if everything and their own media is controlled by a few, then how is this the free world?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and so this is a question from Al-Mukhtar, they asked, is there any talk about Iranian withdrawal from Syria, Yemen, Iraq in exchange for lifting sanctions?
First of all, Iran doesn't have troops in Yemen or Syria, or Iraq, sorry. There are no Iranians in Iraq. The Americans have bases in Iraq. They have thousands of people there. You have the American flag. You have an embassy the size of a country.
True.
Iran has an embassy building and a compound just like any other. No troops in the country. Yemen, Iran has an embassy and no troops there. It's the people of Yemen that are fighting it. The people of Iraq during the war against ISIS, initially there were Iranians there, and then when they became trained, the Hashtag-e-Sha'bi, the Popular Mobilization Force, Iranians and Hezbollah withdrew because Hezbollah was also trained. In Syria, there are troops to help support the Syrian government against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Just a couple of days ago, the Israeli regime hadn't killed any Iranians for a while, for 2-3 years at least. But just a couple of days ago, they killed 2 young men. And of course, in Damascus. So the Israelis can violate international law. They can murder people with children, with families, and people who are there to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because there haven't been any attacks on Israel. But they can carry out, but Western media will say nothing, not condemn it. No, why? Because this is a Eurocentric world that we live in. This is an exceptionalist West. This is a supremacist West. They consider themselves to be superior to everyone else, and that's why the reaction to Ukraine is so infinitely different from anything else that we've seen outside of Europe.
Yep. And
are there still people watching? I think everyone's left. It's just you and me and
it's actually,
Jonathan and
there's even more. It's 1,600 now, so that's very good. Again, remember, guys, hit the like button, because YouTube, as we were just talking about, they don't really like independent media in the West or alternative media. So make sure you hit the like button, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. You'll see a lot more of Professor Marandi. He's great. We have a comment here, not a question, just a comment from A-Wire Link. He said, great to see a highly intelligent man such as Professor Marandi and Richard doing such a great interview. God bless you both. So there,
you want to say that again?
There's more. Here's one from Isaac.
Well, thank you. I'm just joking.
Isaac says, thank you, Professor. Exactly what I said. There's actually many comments. I have to go through them over here.
They're very kind.
Yeah, it's
read the nasty ones.
I mean, Kevin asked, is an Iran-U.S. nuclear deal on the horizon? I'm guessing we kind of
We'll see.
Right, we answered
there
that.
There are complications.
Yeah.
But we're patient. And the world is changing.
Neutralitate asked, is there a possible military alliance between China, Russia, and Iran?
No, I don't think Iran would join any military alliance with any. Iran looks to the east because Iran wants to break away from the Eurocentric mold. But that doesn't mean Iran is going to be in a camp. Iran's relations with Russia and China are better than Europe and the United States because they've treated Iran better. The liberals in Iran like to wreck Iran's relationship with Russia and China. But Russia and China have treated Iran much better than Western countries. Even though Western countries are heavily indebted to Iran. They brought about a coup in Iran. They imposed the Shah on the Iranian people. They created the secret police that killed thousands of people. They supported the Shah when thousands of people were being murdered on the streets of Tehran and other major cities. They supported Saddam Hussein. They imposed maximum pressure sanctions to kill ordinary Iranians. They are heavily they owe Iran. You know, people like myself survive chemical weapons. In an ideal world, they should be paying hundreds of billions of dollars in compensation. But so the Chinese and the Russians have been much better. But Iran looks to the east because Iran no longer believes in the Eurocentric world. Iran wants to be global. So it looks to the east, but it also looks to the global south. It looks to its neighbors. And if Western countries change, and they change in their nature, and they become normal countries, then Iran would have normal relations with all Western countries as well. if the Israeli regime put aside apartheid,
Yep.
if apartheid was removed from the equation, then the nature of the whole Palestine would change. Just like apartheid, Iran was one of the few countries that not only did not recognize apartheid South Africa, but funded the resistance. Whereas Western countries were supporting apartheid. The United States considered Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist and the ANC to be a terrorist organization. And even after Mandela became president and his presidency ended, he was still a terrorist until 2008, according to US law. So Iran, but when the apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed or ended, Iran established normal ties with South Africa. Iran's problem with Israel is that it is a colonial apartheid regime that carries out ethnic cleansing and murder. And just like apartheid South Africa. But if ordinary Jews in Israel who are opposed to Zionist supremacism were to, let's say, gain the upper hand and to recognize the rights of all Palestinians, everything would change. So this is about injustice, whether it's the United States, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Europe. It's their behavior towards Iran. Iran had very poor relations with the Soviet Union. After the collapse, Russia changed its behavior towards Iran. Iran's relationship evolved. If the Russians maintain good relations with Iran, if the Chinese maintain good relations with Iran, so much the better. If the Europeans change their attitude towards Iran, the relationship will evolve. So for Iran, looking to the East does not mean negating everyone else. It does not mean a rejection of everything else. It means not to look at the world in hierarchical terms. One race superior. And that's how it's viewed right now. When you look at Ukraine and then suddenly everyone is in despair and they can't sleep at night, and you see in this, you were just telling me before the program, and people in their windows, they put up the flag of Ukraine. Well, but why not? Why didn't anyone do it for Yemen or Libya or Venezuela or these other countries? That is the problem. And that is why Iran wants to tilt away from the West, not to negate the France, because they don't want to be reliant on the West. They want options across the board, and I think that's the sane thing to do and the moral thing to do.
I think that kind of goes into the next question. I forgot who asked this, but they said, Professor, what response could we anticipate if the United States approach Iran for oil, for sanctions relief, similar to what they're trying to do in Venezuela? I think I sort of asked you that question before.
It depends. I think that it depends on how far the Americans are willing to go. If the Americans change substantially in a meaningful way, but if the Americans want to cheat Iran or cheat Venezuela, then I think they should just be ignored. But there has to be a change in the way the United States behaves. The United States has to learn how to behave like a normal country. Europeans have to learn how to behave like a normal country. Their regimes are supremacist regimes. They speak about Black Lives Matter. But, when we look at the globe, we know that even Russian lives don't matter, because Russians are Orientalized. Again, regardless of the war itself. And we already discussed that in my opinion, NATO is evil. What they did in Ukraine was evil. The coup, supporting Nazis, but the war is also evil. Supporting the murder of Russian Ukrainians, and all, that's all evil. The war is evil too. I blame NATO more than anyone else, but I don't accept the war at all. War is wrong. It is evil, and it is unacceptable.
Yep.
But if the United States, going back to the previous question, if the United States were to change its attitude, if it would evolve into a more sane regime, then why not? There's no reason why Iran should be hostile towards the Americans if the Americans change their attitude towards Iran. But of course, if the Americans were to change their attitude towards Iran, that means they would also have to change their attitude towards Palestine, towards
Right.
You know, it's not just, it's a package. You have, if you change, it means that your worldview changes. If you're suddenly awakening, going to wake up and be against racism, then it has to be, you have to oppose racism, whether it's in Indonesia or China or Nigeria or Bolivia. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
You have to, comes as a, if you change towards Iran, then that means, if you really change, that means you change your worldview beyond Iran's borders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put it very succinctly, Professor. If I might say so, it's a package, right? It would, it would include the others. Perhaps the last question. This is from Mariam, and she asks, "Do you think U.S. aligned fighters like ISIS and the Azov battalion, so these neo-Nazis in Ukraine, are they deliberately chosen to have atrocious ideologies, such as like a kill switch for when they lose their usefulness?"
I don't have an answer to that, but what I can say is that the Americans and their allies used these groups, the Nazis and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because they function like shock and awe. The Americans use shock and awe when they want to destroy a country, because they want people to be in fear. Why did they, when they bombed Baghdad, they used shock and awe?
Yep.
Why? Not only did they want to destroy the infrastructure, but they wanted people to be in fear of the United States, in awe. ISIS and these Nazi groups do the same thing. When they murder people, when they carry out outrages, that's done intentionally. When ISIS went into Iraq, the whole army in northern Iraq just fled.
Yeah.
Before they even got there. Why? Because they had created this image that they are brutal, ruthless monsters, which they were. The Nazis are the same thing. I mean, the crimes committed in Ukraine, in Poland, by these same, the forefathers of these same Ukrainians who are now allies of the United States. Those crimes were horrific against Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, anyone. So, I think that these tools, or like in Nicaragua, the Contras, monsters. These tools they use these groups that are extremely brutal with extreme and disgusting ideologies, because the fear that they create has a massive impact, like shock and awe.
Yep.
I think the Americans would like to have this switch, though, as I think Mariam asked, to suddenly shut it down. But it doesn't work that way. Once you create the monster, you can't just simply kill it.
You mentioned something interesting earlier, Professor, with you said a lot of interesting things, but specifically about these people coming back and returning from Ukraine afterwards. They'll probably be arrested and so on. Yeah, I've no doubt. I mean, they were even arresting people in the UK who had gone to Syria to fight with Kurds against ISIS. And I mean, yeah, okay, that's a noble cause, fighting against ISIS, but it just it shows you that
although those Kurdish groups were themselves manipulated by the Americans and preventing the Syrians from accessing their own resources in Syria, but but it's even worse than that, in that ISIS has created a culture of extremism in different areas, and so intelligence agencies in countries across the world are going to police their people worse than before as a result. But playing with Nazis in Europe is much more dangerous for Europeans. Just like ISIS is much more dangerous in those areas where they supported them. Not playing with Nazis in Europe, these people, when they go back, they may be arrested, they may not be arrested, but a culture of extremism and ethnocentric ideology will be created, which may not necessarily be militant, but it could have an impact on, it could create a huge movement within different communities, societies across Europe, especially as the economic situation is worse. So playing with ISIS has been destructive for much of West Asia, North Africa, but playing with the Nazis has much more potential for destruction in a continent devastated by the Nazis.
Yeah.
Once. I'm not saying that the only evil in Europe were the Nazis. I mean, Hitler was obviously evil, but I would like to remind everyone that Churchill did a lot of what Hitler did to Europeans to the rest of the world.
Yep.
The empire was brutal in West Asia. They used chemical weapons. If they gassed people in Europe, they used chemical weapons in Iraq. Churchill was an extremely racist person. So, I'm not saying that it was good versus bad, but in any case, the Nazis are a major threat to Europe. And playing with the Nazis just so that you can hurt the Russians, it will definitely come back to bite these people. I have no doubt about it.
Guys, I forgot to ask you, where are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments where you guys are, where you're watching from. Professor, perhaps a last point. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
You already said the last question. You only gave me half a cup of Coke, but anyway. What time is it? I don't know how I'm going to get back to the hotel.
Well...
Yeah, no, ask the question, yeah.
I wanted to point out the irony that they always talk about the Palestinians being anti-Semitic, and here we have NATO and the UK and the US. They're sending weapons to neo-Nazis, like actual anti-Semites.
And they try to hide it by saying, but the president is Jewish. Yes, the president is Jewish, but what does that have to do with anything? You're using these as tools for your own purposes. In Syria, that's exactly what they did. They used, on the ground in Syria, you had ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these other groups, Jaish al-Islam, and so on and so forth. And then you had those gentlemen in their ties and suits representing the free Syrian opposition in different countries, in five-star hotels, and going in front of TV, and all these young girls, young women, talking about the innocent Syrians. But these people, they would never set or be able to set foot in those areas that were held by these groups. So, it's quite extraordinary. It's stunning, the sort of narratives they create or the narratives that they hide. It's clear, and you probably know about. I think you also tweeted the NATO tweet.
Oh yeah.
Of the woman on
yeah, let me see if I can pull that up. Maybe you can explain to the viewers.
Yeah, so in the tweet there's this they're celebrating International Women's Day, and there's a picture of a Ukrainian soldier, a woman soldier, and then there's a
patch, I think.
A patch, yeah, or something like that, which is a Nazi symbol. And then they found out and they deleted the tweet. So that doesn't show that they're the good guys and they deleted the tweet because this is bad. Because they're still supporting these people. But they don't want to show the fact that they are supporting these people. So if they were intellectually honest, then NATO would say, wow, this woman where is she from? So we must sanction this particular brigade or this unit that's using these Nazi symbols. But they don't do that. They just delete the tweet to hide the fact that they're supporting extremists, just like what they did in Syria. Their reporters, their journalists knew exactly what was going on, but everyone tried to hide the truth. But the truth will come out ultimately. People will know when the history books are written. But the issue is that regardless of the crimes that are committed today by these extremist groups, and the fact that these extremist groups pushed the Russians into invasion, even though the invasion I think is absolutely wrong and immoral, but the immoral act of supporting these groups against Russians and the Russian people and the coup and all that in the Ukraine, those extremists will come back, will ultimately haunt many countries across.
Yeah, I was just as you were explaining it, I showed the tweet, yeah, that NATO deleted. I mean, again, I'm just going to pull this up so people can see. There's this woman over here, and right there on her chest, you can see this black sun symbol. There it is when you zoom in, and of course, that's I think it's called a Sonnenrad. That's the name of the symbol. But yeah, again, it's another one of those.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, that's it.
Yep. So the Nazis are okay, but just don't tweet about them. On NATO, at least, shouldn't tweet.
Yep. Yeah, it's incredible, honestly. Professor, any closing remarks? Anything you'd like to add that we didn't touch on?
No, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me and congratulate you on your fantastic job. And I learn a lot from your programs and the programs of others who are doing their best in difficult circumstances to tell people the truth.
Thank you.
And I think it's very courageous, because right now, under these circumstances, exposing NATO for what it is, the expansion of NATO, their support for neo-Nazis, their support for extremists, is very difficult. It's just like trying to expose ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others in Syria during 2013-14. Back then, we were called evil mouthpieces of an evil regime and so on. And now there'll be Putin. What? There was a word for it. Putin
puppets.
Puppets or whatever.
Kremlin, whatever.
Yeah, and all that. But the fact is that people have to hammer this home. People have to show, expose these realities to the public, because that's in the interest of everyone across not only Europe but across the world.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Professor. And again, I want to thank you for your time, for your kind words.
Thank you for having me.
You're just as the viewer said, very knowledgeable. It's always a pleasure to pick your brain and sit here with you.
Okay.
And I'll just put up your Twitter on the screen so people can follow you. Again, the professor's handle is @S_M_Marandi. It's right there on the screen if you want to follow him. Again, always a pleasure to have you here, Professor. And I hope perhaps when the nuclear deal is concluded, we can maybe sit down again. That would be a huge pleasure, and I'm sure the viewers would appreciate it. But of course, all in good time.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
If there is a deal and if things are sorted out, I will probably we'll probably immediately go back to Iran, because everyone just wants to go home. We are.
Yeah.
But we can do something from Tehran without a doubt. It'd be my honor.
Great, that would be wonderful. And again, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. Again, this is one of the only places you're going to get anything about the Iran nuclear deal that isn't curated by Western mainstream media. And again, there's U.S. politics, international relations, you name it, I do it. And again, if you haven't hit the like button, make sure you interact in some way. Just leave a comment. It helps with fight the algorithm. YouTube tries to bury these channels, in a cave. Rumble, I've been told to go on there. People have told me to make an account. I haven't made one yet, but I'm on YouTube and Rockfin. So those are the two ones.
You should try to do all of them at the same time if it's doable.
Yeah. I'll definitely try to do that.
You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, precisely. It's a bit risky. So again, as the professor said, there are other platforms. I'm on Rockfin as well. So right now I'm streaming on YouTube. I'm also streaming on Rockfin, and it's totally free. The only annoyance is you have to make an account. That's it. You just put an email, whatever. So it's ROKFIN.com/RichardMedhurst. And if you want to support the show, you want to buy the professor a Coca-Cola, you can donate here on PayPal or Patreon. I'll leave all the links below. Again,
donate to him, but I have no doubt he won't give me anything. He won't even give me half a Coke.
Well, Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Richard.
My pleasure.
Well done, as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm grateful, very grateful.
All right, take care, guys.
Thank you, and I'm very grateful to your audience for tolerating me this whole time. I think it's been pretty long. I hope they all have a very good day, and I hope the war ends soon, and I hope that things change for people across the globe for the better. Even though I think in the short term it's going to get much worse, but hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, inshallah. I hope so too. I think that's the best thing that these talks, these diplomatic talks they're having in Ukraine. I hope they lead to something.
Hopefully.
And again, just a reminder, I'll be live again tomorrow at the same time with Diliana to talk about these biolabs. She's been talking about this stuff for years. She was ahead of the curve. And again, same time tomorrow. So I'll see you guys then. And thanks to everyone for tuning in, for all your support. I really appreciate it. You guys are the best. Thank you. All right, take care, guys. Ma salame.